welcome to a Paper Quest side quest, where we provide you with a bite-sized, spoiler-free review of one of our solo books. Today I'm going to review Dune by Frank Herbert, possibly one of the most well-known books ever printed. Even if you haven't read it, you've almost certainly heard of it, especially now since it's a modern-day movie. Many people would argue this is one of the most influential books in modern times. It's a book I've always told myself I was going to read for years, since high school probably. Never got around to it. Then the movie came out last year, and I told myself once again that I would read it before it released. And again, I didn't do it. But after seeing the movie, even though it wasn't perfect, I was certainly hooked. I was all in on it, so I rushed out and got the book and read it through. So after all these years, was it finally worth it? I would say pretty much. I think it's at its strongest in the beginning of the novel and some parts in the middle, but the back third of the book does become kind of a mess for me. Before I give my brief synopsis, I do want to point out that this book is heavy with politics and plans and all sorts of details and subtleties that I can't possibly explain in a single summary. There is a lot going on here. But at its absolute basic, we follow Paul, his father Leto, and mother Jessica. They are the royal family. They're House Atreides. As they gain in popularity, the Emperor of Known Space, along with the Baron of House Harkonnen, which is sort of a rival house in this epic, they basically devise this complex plan to allow House Atreides to take over the planet Dune, or as it's called in the book, Arrakis. Arrakis is a mostly desert planet, initially controlled by the evil House Harkonnen. It's where spice is harvested, which is an extremely large source of income for the overall empire. For reasons that are explained throughout the novel, it is the Barons and the Emperor's goal to trick House Atreides here, and then end their line and sort of end their rule, their popularity. The Atreides do know this. They know from the beginning that this is clearly a plan, but they have to go along with it for fear of doing something against the Emperor's orders. So Paul, the main character we're following, as one might expect from a main character in any book, is special. He is a very powerful mentat, maybe even more than that. Mentats are basically someone who is extremely smart, like supercomputer smart, but like to an even greater degree. They can do all sorts of things. We spend much of this book learning about Paul's consistently growing mental capacities, his connection to the Freemen, who are the native people to Arrakis, and his possible connection to myths, legends, religions, in the grand scheme of the universe. So this is where I get to my first concern. I love sci-fi. I love fantasy. I do not like when sci-fi relies on fantasy. It may sound dumb, but it kind of pulls me out of the realism of the sci-fi story that I'm trying to read. And there are just some things that happen in this book that take it too far for me, to a point where the author could tell me anything, and I think, okay, I guess that's something these people can do now. Unfortunately, my specific complaints come very close to the end of the book, so I don't want to spoil what these things are, as it's pretty important to a few scenes. There is one character in particular we get introduced to very late in the story. I will just say it's a very young girl, and I find it to be the absolute weirdest thing about the entire book. And her whole existence, her whole backstory is just insane and very creepy if you think too hard about it. Let's jump back to the beginning of the book and work our way through. When this book starts, you are thrown right into things. You will need to quickly learn lots of made-up words, planets, languages, etc. They come hard and fast, but it's exciting. It's fun. I love, the back of the book has a sort of lexicon or dictionary to help you remember what some of these things are. It's always fun learning a new world or a new universe like this. I definitely lost myself in the book, in a good way, to watching the main characters, the Atreides, uplifted from their life of peace, popularity, their wet, bountiful green planet, and thrown into a life of difficulty, paranoia, a world where water is extremely valuable, It's like the most valuable resource on the planet. The detail in the book is somehow both there and not. The author doesn't bombard you with details, but you can picture everything you need to. It's done well, even though it does make you think. You're definitely up to your imagination. Arrakis is so plain and so empty, yet there's apparently so much to learn about it. Each chapter starts with a passage from like a fake in-universe textbook or religious book. It's hard to say, but there's this princess who's relaying these passages to us before each chapter starts, which adds to the lore of the universe and the future of the universe since they reference near future events. But it's kind of a double-edged sword because as much as I love that detail in that lore, it also spoils the book going forward, even sometimes in a scene or a chapter you're just about to read. So I'm not sure why this decision was made, but a lot of the twists and turns are right there in this, in-universe fake textbook. And then when you hit that point in the actual book, you already expected it. So some of that excitement is lost. You're just more waiting for when it's going to happen with the foreknowledge. It's a very interesting choice. As cool as the passages are, none of them were required for the book because everything in the passages were going to happen anyways. Moving on to some of the villains, I would say, even though there's a small handful, it's best just to talk about two, which is Baron Harkonnen and the Emperor. I don't have too much to say. They don't get a ton of screen time, if you will, but when they do, they are very creepy, very evil, very scary, extremely cunning. They're always 6 steps ahead. They know everything that has to get done before anybody else. They know exactly how to plan everything. I mean, they are the whole reason why this book exists and how they tricked House Atreides off of their own planet, basically. So by the end of the book, it kind of just turns into a complete joke for me. Maybe I'm reading into it wrong, or I don't know. I don't know where it lost me, but they go from these evil, creepy, cunning bad guys to just somewhat of a joke to me. Not that they do anything stupid per se, but the way it all ends just falls flat. It just falls flat for me. They just became nobodies in my eyes. It was no longer important that these were villains. I mean, in some ways it was, but it ends very weird. All the planning seems to get thrown out the door, and that was kind of a huge turnoff. But that falls directly in line with how I felt about the jarring differences between the beginning and the end. They're just two entirely different entities. The beginning is so well-paced and detailed. We learn about spice harvesting, the gigantic sandworms, how the Fremen live their lives. We learn about the still suits, as they call them, which recycle one's bodily wastes and allows you to drink from it again. This is how they survive and trek through the desert. The ending is just the opposite. We're skipping over entire scenes, missing entire characters being introduced off-screen, if you will, being told, here they are now, and there's no time to get to know them or care because we're pressing on into the next event. And the book ends so abruptly, so immediately, that you feel like the last chapter was never glued into the spine of the book. In hindsight, we know that the author would eventually write a sequel. But if this was a book you planned on reading on its own or didn't know there were sequels, I think it's very poorly done as an ending. The book was written in the 60s. You could say it was a different time. Things were written differently. We've come much further in how authors write a book, open and close a book. There is a definite tone and direction to the writing, which I like. It's clearly an older book, but it's not so old that it reads like a classic. But it adds to the tone, the dark tone of the story very well. I personally gave the book 3 out of 5 stars. I agree that it is worth reading. I would not skip it if you're a sci-fi fan for sure. I understand why people feel it to be so essential, and I think that I agree that it is essential sci-fi reading. I don't think essential books equate to being perfect books. I do wish the ending was not what it was. It all became very outlandish and fantastical, but I definitely think it's worth reading. 3 out of 5. Thanks for listening. Bye.